I could feel the excitement building up inside me as I packed my bags for the trip. The excitement wasn't just about the travel itself, but the reason behind it, Evelina. I'd met her online a few months ago. I had to admit, when I first saw her profile, I wasn't sure what to expect. She was a middle-aged woman, mature yet graceful, with an air of elegance that caught my attention immediately. It wasn't just her looks that drew me in, though. It was her personality, warm, kind, and with a curious sense of humor that made me laugh in ways I hadn't in a long time. We started chatting, and what began as casual conversations quickly turned into something deeper, something real. After weeks of talking, texting, and video calls, I finally convinced her to meet me in person. She'd never traveled that far before, and it took some convincing, but in the end, Evelina agreed to fly to Baton Rouge. She seemed so excited, almost as excited as I was. I think both of us had built up this image of who the other person was, based on our conversations, and we were both eager to see if reality would live up to the fantasy. The moment I saw her at the airport, I knew I had made the right decision. Evelina looked even better in person than she did on camera. Her smile was warm and genuine, her eyes sparkled with a mixture of nerves and anticipation. She had that kind of presence that made you feel comfortable just being around her. When she walked toward me, I couldn't help but feel a rush of emotions. I stood there, waiting for her to reach me, and then, without thinking, I opened my arms and pulled her into a hug. She hesitated at first, but then wrapped her arms around me, and I felt a wave of relief. The chemistry between us was undeniable. The physical connection, the way our bodies fit together in that hug, was more than I had expected. It felt natural, like we'd known each other far longer than just a few months of online conversations. We spent the next few hours just talking, laughing, and walking around Baton Rouge. I took her to some of my favorite spots, showing her the city through my eyes. Everything seemed perfect, like a dream I didn't want to wake up from. Evelina was exactly who I had imagined, and more. She was intelligent, charming, and full of life. We talked about our shared love for the arts, literature, and our mutual dreams of the future. She was honest about her past, and I appreciated her openness. It wasn't always easy to talk about past relationships, but with Evelina, it felt like we could talk about anything without judgment. That night, we went to a cozy little restaurant on the outskirts of town, a place I knew would make her feel special. The atmosphere was intimate, with soft music playing in the background and the dim lighting setting the perfect mood. We shared a meal, a bottle of wine, and continued talking about our hopes, our fears, and everything in between. There was a spark in the air that neither of us could ignore, but we both respected the pace. We were still getting to know each other, and that's the way it should be, right? Over the next few days, we grew closer. I took her around Baton Rouge, showing her the beautiful spots, introducing her to my friends and even my family. Everyone loved her. She had this way of making people feel at ease. It wasn't just her smile, it was her entire demeanor. She was kind, patient, and always made an effort to connect with everyone around her. One evening, as we sat in my living room, drinking coffee and talking about life, she looked at me with those soft, soulful eyes of hers and said something that made my heart skip a beat. "I've been thinking a lot about us," she said, her voice gentle but serious. "About what could be. I feel like we've got something special here, and I want to see where it could go. I know we're still learning about each other, but I think there's something worth exploring." I stared at her for a moment, taking in the weight of her words. She wasn't rushing into anything, but she was being open, being vulnerable, and it felt like a turning point. I wanted to be with her, to build something with her. "I feel the same," I replied, my voice steady but full of emotion. "I think we could have something really great here. Let's take it one step at a time, see where this takes us." "I'm in, Evelina." Her face lit up and she leaned over, pressing her lips to mine in a soft, tender kiss. It was the kind of kiss that made me believe in second chances, in love at any age, in finding something real when you least expect it. But things, as they often do, didn't stay perfect for long. One morning, about a week into her stay, everything changed. Evelina had woken up early to do some work. She had an online business that she ran from home, and that morning she was working on a project that had a looming deadline. I went to the kitchen to make us some coffee, and that's when I heard her phone vibrate on the table. I didn't mean to snoop. Honestly, I didn't. But when I saw a text message pop up on her phone screen, I couldn't resist. It was from a name I didn't recognize, a man's name. The message was brief, but it made my stomach twist with confusion. "Are you coming back soon, love? I miss you. Can't wait to see you." I froze. A chill ran down my spine, and my heart began to race. I felt a sudden wave of nausea. Was she seeing someone else? Had I been misled? The thoughts spiraled out of control, and I felt a sense of betrayal clawing at me, even though I wasn't sure what was happening. I didn't know what to do. Should I confront her about it? Should I pretend I hadn't seen it? I had to know the truth, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I decided to wait until she finished working, to see if she would bring it up on her own. When she finally came out of the room, I tried to act normal, but the tension between us was palpable. Evelina seemed distracted, and I knew something was off. I waited for her to speak, but she didn't. After a few minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. "Evelina," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Who was that text from?" She looked at me, her eyes wide with surprise. She froze, then slowly walked over to the table and picked up her phone. She checked the message, then looked back at me. "It's from my ex," she said quietly, her tone apologetic. "I should have told you, but I didn't think it was necessary. We've been in contact off and on, but I'm not seeing him. He's been going through a tough time, and I've been helping him out. I didn't want you to think I was hiding something." I felt a mixture of relief and frustration. It wasn't what I had imagined, but it was still something that made me uneasy. The way she said it, so calmly like it was no big deal, made me wonder if I was overreacting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. "You've been talking to him this whole time?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. "Even while we've been getting close?" Evelina nodded, her expression apologetic. "I didn't want to complicate things. But now that you know, I want to be completely honest with you. I care about you, Simon. I care about us, and I don't want anything to come between that." I looked at her, trying to process it all. I didn't want to let doubt creep in, but I had to ask myself, was I willing to accept this? Could I trust her completely, or had I just stepped into a situation I wasn't prepared for? I didn't have an answer yet. But one thing was clear, nothing was as simple as it seemed. The next morning, after the tension from the previous night had settled, I woke up with a heavy feeling in my chest. Evelina was still sleeping beside me, and as I lay there, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. She had explained the message from her ex, and I wanted to trust her. I really did. But the doubts had planted a seed, and I wasn't sure how to uproot it. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind wandered to my own situation. I'd never told Evelina much about my finances, but the truth was, things weren't going as well as I had hoped. I'd been struggling for a while now, barely making ends meet. I kept up a good front, of course, and with Evelina around, I tried to push the stress aside. But the truth was, I was behind on bills, and my bank account was running on empty. I had some debts I was barely keeping up with, and the pressure of it all was beginning to build. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I needed help. I knew that asking Evelina wasn't going to be easy, but I figured maybe now was the right time. I had no idea how she would react, but if she really cared about me like she said she did, maybe she'd understand. I could tell her my story, how I'd hit a rough patch, and maybe she'd be willing to help me out, just like she had helped her ex. It was that same rush of desperation that pushed me to send her a message. I tried to make it sound casual, but the weight of it was heavy on my fingers as I typed. I told her that I was in a tough spot financially and that I needed some help to cover some immediate expenses. I made it sound like a temporary problem, just a quick loan that I would pay back as soon as things got better. I waited, not knowing what to expect. And then, after what felt like hours, my phone buzzed with a reply. Evelina said she was sorry to hear about my situation and that she wanted to help me. She asked me how much I needed, and if it wasn't too much trouble, could I explain a bit more about what was going on? I didn't want to go into too much detail, I didn't want to sound pathetic or desperate, but I gave her a little more context. I told her about a few bills I had fallen behind on and the looming threat of late fees. I made sure to emphasize that this was a one-time thing and that I would pay her back as soon as I could. I told her I wasn't asking for much, just enough to get me through until I could catch up. Her response was quick. She didn't hesitate. She said she could send me the money, no problem. She wanted to help me get back on my feet. That was it. She didn't even ask for specifics about how I was going to pay her back. It seemed almost too easy, but I was relieved. The money arrived in my account the next day. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was enough to cover a few bills and give me some breathing room. Evelina's generosity made me feel both grateful and guilty at the same time. I knew I had to find a way to pay her back, but for now, I focused on the immediate relief. Over the next few weeks, though, things took a turn I wasn't prepared for. The requests for money didn't stop. At first, they were small, just enough to cover a few bills here and there. But soon, they grew in frequency and in size. One day, it was for a medical emergency. The next, it was for a car repair. Then, she needed money to help a friend who was struggling. Each time, I felt more and more pressure to send her whatever I could. I told myself it was just temporary, that things would get better, and that I could repay her once I got back on my feet. But the requests kept coming. It was always some new problem, always some new crisis that required immediate funds. And each time, Evelina seemed so calm about it, so eager to help. She would reassure me that she didn't mind, that this was just what you did for the people you cared about. She made it sound so natural, so loving. She never once questioned the frequency of my requests or asked for anything in return. I knew she believed in me, that she trusted me. And that trust was something I couldn't afford to lose, not if I wanted to keep her around. But as the weeks went by, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of discomfort in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't just the money, it was the way she seemed so willing to give, without hesitation, without asking questions. At first, I justified it. I told myself that she was just being supportive, that this was part of what it meant to be in a relationship. But deep down, I started to wonder if I was taking advantage of her generosity. The money I was sending her wasn't small. It was substantial, enough that it began to strain my own finances. Each time she asked, I had to dip further into savings or take out loans just to cover it. I told myself it would all work out, that things would stabilize eventually, but deep down, I knew I was beginning to spiral. One day, I got a message from her that hit me like a ton of bricks. Evelina told me that she had been talking to a financial advisor about a long-term investment opportunity, but she needed a bit more money to get started. She asked me if I could send her another significant sum, something she could use to secure this opportunity. That was the moment I realized I couldn't keep up anymore. This wasn't just about temporary help anymore. It was becoming a pattern. It was becoming a dependency, and I was starting to feel like I was drowning in it. I didn't know how to say no, though. Every time I even considered it, I thought of her warm smile, her gentle voice, and how much she seemed to care. I could tell she didn't think anything was wrong. To her, helping me was just something you did when you loved someone. But to me, it felt like I was slowly being consumed by this cycle of requests. I could barely keep track of the money I was sending her. It felt like the more I gave, the more she needed. Still, I didn't want to lose her. So, I sent the money. I told myself it would be the last time, that this would be the last request. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I was trapped, and no matter how much I told myself I could handle it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into something far deeper and more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. Evelina didn't hesitate to send me a thank you message, telling me how much she appreciated my support. She was always so gracious, so kind. It made me feel like the worst person in the world, like I was letting her down. I didn't want to disappoint her. But the more I gave, the more I felt like I was losing myself in the process. I was sinking deeper, every day. It wasn't just the financial strain, it was the lies I told myself, the guilt that weighed me down, the gnawing feeling that something was wrong. But I didn't know how to stop it. Every time Evelina needed something, I convinced myself it was temporary. I kept telling myself she was just being supportive, that she loved me, and that this was what you did for the people you cared about. But with each request for money, I felt a little more lost, a little more like I was trapped in something I couldn't control. I wasn't just lying to her, I was lying to myself. But that day, when I saw my friends again, things took a darker turn. They knew the situation I was in. They knew I was desperate. I tried to borrow from them, but no one had the kind of cash I needed to keep up the charade. That's when one of them, Jake, a guy I'd known for years, suggested something I hadn't even considered. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, and said, "Why don't you just take it? Take everything she's got. You've been giving her so much, she's probably loaded. We'll get in, get out, and you won't have to worry about paying her back anymore. Hell, you could make a real run of it." I'd never thought about it like that. The thought repulsed me at first. How could I rob her? She was trusting me with everything. But as I stared at the desperation in Jake's eyes, the pressure mounting in my chest, the idea started to seem reasonable. I was stuck, I needed money, and she had everything I could possibly want. Money, jewelry, anything that could get me out of this hole. I didn't want to go through with it, but deep down, I knew I had no other options. Jake and a couple of other guys I trusted, Mike and Tony, came over to my place that night, and we talked about how to pull it off. We all knew Evelina's apartment by heart. I'd spent enough time there that I knew the layout, the security, everything. I told them I'd keep her busy. I had to be the one to keep her distracted, to make sure she wasn't home when they went in. The plan was simple. Get in, take the cash, the jewelry, whatever we could find, and get out before she even knew what hit her. The following evening, when I knew Evelina would be out, I told her I needed to go out for a while. She'd been so trusting lately, so eager to believe in us, and when I asked for just a little more space to take care of some things, she didn't think twice. She smiled at me, kissed me on the cheek, and told me to take care. I watched her leave, the door clicking shut behind her, and my stomach twisted with guilt. But I didn't stop. I texted Jake to let him know it was time. They arrived at her building in less than an hour, and I met them outside. We waited until Evelina's car disappeared around the corner before heading up to her apartment. Mike had brought the tools. Nothing too fancy, just enough to break in quickly. He worked the lock with ease, and before we knew it, we were inside. The place was quiet, too quiet. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, a mix of fear and excitement coursing through me. It wasn't just the thrill, it was the need, the desperate hunger to fix everything that was falling apart. Jake went straight to the bedroom. He knew where she kept her things, her jewelry box, her purse, her phone. I had been there enough to know the routine. Tony started rifling through the living room, checking the drawers and cabinets for anything of value. As they went to work, I just stood there, frozen. I didn't know what I was waiting for, what I was hoping to feel. Guilt? Maybe. But also relief. They found everything we needed. Jake came back with her purse, her jewelry box, and her phone. He handed them to me, his face grim. "This'll do for now. Let's get out of here," he said, his voice low. But I didn't move. I just stared at the items in my hands, the jewelry that sparkled like it was worth more than everything I had ever owned. The phone, which held everything I could use to control her. For a moment I stood there, my mind reeling. How did it come to this? How had I gone from the guy she trusted to the one who was stealing from her? But there was no turning back. I had to do this. I had to fix everything. And if I couldn't fix it, at least I could have the money to survive. We left the apartment quickly, taking everything with us. As I walked out of the building, I tried to push down the feelings of guilt, but they were there, growing louder with each step. I kept telling myself it was for the best. This would solve everything. She would never know, and in the end, it would all work out. When I got back to my apartment, I felt a strange numbness. I wasn't proud of what I'd done, but I wasn't sorry either. I had to survive. I had to fix this mess I'd gotten myself into. But Evelina came home that night, and when she walked through the door, the look on her face stopped me in my tracks. She looked different. I hadn't expected her to look so lost, so broken. She had a kind of sadness in her eyes that made my stomach drop. It was like she could see right through me, even though I tried to play it cool. She didn't say anything at first. She just stared at me, her eyes scanning my face like she was looking for something. "Simon," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happened?" I knew immediately. The panic on her face told me she'd noticed the missing things. The jewelry, the money, her phone. I could tell she was struggling to keep her emotions in check. There was a kind of fragility about her, like she was hanging on to something, but she didn't know what it was anymore. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, watching her fall apart in front of me. Her voice cracked as she spoke again. "Simon, where is it? Where is everything? I trusted you. How could you do this?" I didn't respond. What was there to say? I couldn't tell her the truth. I couldn't admit what I had done. I couldn't admit how far I had fallen. So I just stood there, silent, waiting for her to break. She didn't shout or cry right away. She just stared at me, like she was trying to find a reason, trying to make sense of it. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke again. "Please, Simon, don't do this. I've given you everything. I've trusted you. What more do you want from me?" I didn't know what to say. I couldn't say anything. And that's when it happened. Her voice trembled as she took a step toward me. "Please, Simon, just tell me what you need. Take it all if you want. Just don't leave me like this. I've already lost so much. Please, just take everything. Take whatever you need." She was broken. I could see it now, clearer than ever before. She was no longer the confident, trusting woman I had met. She was shattered, and I was the one who had destroyed her. But I didn't feel any of the guilt I should have felt. Instead, I just nodded. I held out my hand. "Give me what you have left," I demanded. Without another word, she handed over the last of her savings, whatever she had left. Everything she had. And I took it. Then I walked out the door, leaving her behind. When I stepped out of her apartment that night, the cold air hit me like a slap, but it didn't shake me. I was numb, detached from everything around me. The guilt was there, buried deep under layers of anger and shame, but I couldn't afford to think about it. I had everything I needed. Money, jewelry, her phone. The whole mess was behind me, or so I thought. But when I heard the knock on the door that night, I froze. It was Evelina. Of course, it was her. I didn't know what she'd come for, what she expected, but I felt a sinking feeling in my gut. She had to have realized something was wrong by now. Maybe she had pieced things together. Maybe she knew I'd taken everything. I wasn't sure what her plan was, but I knew one thing. I couldn't let her get close. I didn't answer at first. My mind raced, trying to come up with an excuse, a lie. But there was no time. The knock came again, harder this time, more insistent. "Simon." Her voice was shaky, filled with confusion and hurt. "Open the door. Please. I need to know what's going on. Why did you do this?" I heard the desperation in her voice. She was scared, yes, but more than that, she was trying to understand. She wanted answers. And I knew that if I opened that door, she'd demand the truth. She'd see right through me. She was smart, too smart. She would piece it together in an instant. But I couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not after everything. I stood there, my hand on the door handle, hesitating for just a moment. She was crying now, begging me. Her voice trembled, and my heart skipped a beat. She was breaking. And I, who was the one who had done this to her. But I had to do it. I couldn't back out now. I couldn't go back. With a deep breath, I opened the door. Her eyes met mine, wide with a mix of confusion and pain. She saw the look on my face, and it didn't take long for her to know something was wrong. She stepped forward, her hands shaking as she reached out for me. "Simon, please talk to me. I don't understand. Where's my stuff? What's going on? What did you do?" Her voice was breaking, but she was still standing there, looking at me, her gaze full of questions. For a moment, I felt the weight of what I'd done. The guilt, the regret, everything flooded back. But then it hit me, there was no turning back now. I couldn't let her keep asking, keep digging. I couldn't let her take everything I'd worked so hard to build. I pushed her back hard, just to create some space between us. She stumbled, but steadied herself quickly, her eyes now filled with shock and fear. "What's happening?" she gasped. "Why are you doing this to me?" I could hear the panic in her voice, but I didn't care. All I could think about was the way she looked at me, so broken, so confused. She deserved answers, but I didn't have any. There was no way I could explain it to her. There was no way I could tell her what I had become, how far I had fallen. So I kept my mouth shut, my hands trembling. I wasn't thinking anymore. It wasn't about logic, it wasn't about anything but survival. I moved quickly, pushing her away again when she tried to grab my arm. She was frantic now, calling my name, asking what was wrong. Her hands reached for me, but I couldn't let her touch me. I grabbed the knife. It was on the kitchen counter, sharp and heavy, gleaming under the dim light. I didn't even think about it. One moment she was pleading with me, trying to understand, and the next, I was holding the blade. "Simon, please." Her voice was barely a whisper, but I could see it in her eyes. She was starting to realize. She was starting to understand that there was no going back from this. I don't remember exactly what happened after that. I don't remember the exact movements, the exact actions. It happened so quickly. One moment she was standing there, terrified, and the next, I was in motion. The knife slipped in so easily, too easily. The shock on her face stayed with me for a second, just long enough to register what I had done. I heard her gasp, a soft, choking sound, before she crumpled to the floor, blood spilling from the wound. The red started to pool around her, seeping into the carpet, into the walls of my mind. I stood there, staring at her, watching her struggle. I had done it. I had killed her. And still, there was no remorse. Her hand reached out, trembling, trying to grab hold of something. Her fingers brushed the floor, reaching for me, but there was nothing I could do now. The life was draining out of her, the light in her eyes flickering and fading as the seconds ticked by. She tried to speak, but it was too late. There was nothing left for her to say. I heard the sounds of her breathing, growing slower and more labored. Her body twisted as the blood continued to spill from the wound, the air thick with the smell of metal. I don't remember how long it took. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. By the time she stopped moving, I was already planning my next move. The rest of her things, the money, the jewelry, I couldn't leave them behind. I couldn't leave any trace that I had been here. I turned away from her body, wiped the knife clean, and grabbed the bag of stolen goods. My mind was already racing ahead. I wasn't going to stay. I couldn't afford to. This had to end. I left the apartment, the door slamming behind me, but I didn't look back. I knew what I had done, and I knew what would come next, but for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel afraid. I felt free. Evelina was gone now, and there was nothing left for me here. I had taken what I needed, and now I could finally move on. The blood on my hands wasn't something I could wash away. But I would try. Always did. The phone call came in the middle of the afternoon, just as I was finishing up a beer and flicking through a few online articles. My phone buzzed on the counter, and without thinking, I answered it. Sophie, the voice on the other end was calm, steady, but I could hear the underlying tension in the officer's tone. "This is Officer Daniels from the Baton Rouge Police Department. I regret to inform you that your mother, Evelina, has passed away. She was the victim of a violent crime." The words didn't register at first. They bounced around in my brain, confusing, out of place, like I'd heard them in a dream. I sat there, frozen for a second, staring at the phone in my hand. Sophie, Evelina's daughter. She had no idea. The officer continued, his voice professionally detached, explaining the details in a way that didn't seem real. He told Sophie to come down to the precinct to identify her mother's body, to make arrangements. I could hear the emotion in Sophie's voice as she asked for more details, but the officer didn't offer much more than the basics. There was something about the way he spoke, the way he said violent crime, that made it feel final. There was no chance for a second chance, no way for Evelina to come back. I'd done what I'd done, and now someone else was going to pay for it. Sophie's disbelief hung in the air even after the officer had hung up, leaving her in stunned silence. I could hear her sobbing from across the room, her grief spilling out in slow, broken breaths. It was clear she hadn't known what was really happening, hadn't seen the signs. I'd heard her talk about her mother, how close they were, how much they meant to each other. And now, Sophie was going to have to pick up the pieces of a life shattered, trying to make sense of a world that had turned upside down in an instant. I had a moment then, just a moment, where I imagined what Sophie must have been feeling. The pain of loss. The horror of learning the truth. but I pushed it away quickly. It didn't matter. It never did. Still, there was something else, something nagging at the back of my mind. Sophie had never been far from her mother's life. Evelina had always talked about her daughter with a kind of warmth that made me uncomfortable at times. I wasn't sure what it meant, but I could see now, in the aftermath of everything, that Sophie had been the one person Evelina had trusted completely. I couldn't help but think, did Sophie know something? Did she suspect there was more going on than she realized? I could only imagine the guilt she must have felt now, as she processed the loss of her mother. Was she blaming herself? I wasn't surprised when Sophie showed up at the police station hours later. She was a small woman, just under 5 feet, but there was something tough about her, a strength that Evelina had passed down to her. She barely spoke to anyone in the station, moving through the hallways like a ghost. I could see it in her eyes. Her mother's death hadn't just shocked her, it had shattered her. The officer who had called her earlier explained the basics once again, but Sophie barely responded. She looked like she was in some kind of haze, like the world was moving too fast for her to catch up. When the officer led her into the room where Evelina's body was, the last thing I wanted to do was watch. I didn't need to see her face, didn't need to witness the moment Sophie realized what I had done. But part of me couldn't help it. I couldn't pull away. Sophie stood there in front of her mother's lifeless body, her face twisted with disbelief and sorrow. It was like the air had been sucked out of the room, and all that was left was silence. She reached out to touch her mother's hand, but then jerked back, as if the reality of what had happened was still too much to bear. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I saw the way Sophie's eyes filled with tears. I saw her shaking her head, unable to process the reality in front of her. I couldn't help but wonder, did she know that something had been wrong with her mother before this? Did she suspect? Or was she just as blindsided as the rest of us? The days after were a blur. Sophie seemed to go through the motions, making funeral arrangements, handling the police inquiries, but there was an emptiness in her eyes. I could see the wheels turning in her head, her mind piecing things together. She was struggling with something deeper than the grief alone. I knew she had started to notice the changes in her mother, the way Evelina had become distant, the way she'd started making strange decisions. But what if Sophie hadn't connected the dots? What if she blamed herself for not intervening more, for not seeing the signs of her mother's destruction earlier? Sophie had always been the protective type, always watching out for her mom. But even with her best intentions, she hadn't been able to stop what happened. I could see it in her eyes when she spoke to friends or family, the way she tried to hold it together, like she was missing something, a piece of the puzzle she hadn't been able to solve. She had started asking questions about her mother's recent behavior, about the people she had been spending time with, about the money. She mentioned how Evelina had seemed distracted, more withdrawn, but Sophie had no idea what was really going on. Sophie wasn't stupid. I knew that. She would start digging deeper, asking more questions. She would start to doubt everything, wondering if she could have done something differently. She would replay every conversation, every moment she spent with her mother over the last few months, wondering if there were signs she missed. And then, the worst part of it all, she would wonder if she could have stopped it. Could she have prevented the tragedy? Could she have saved her mother before it was too late? It didn't take long before Sophie began to change. I could see the doubt creeping into her mind, even as she tried to hold herself together. She started to pull away from everyone, keeping to herself, questioning everything Evelina had ever told her. The guilt had begun to take root in her heart. And she didn't even know the half of it. She was beginning to realize something that even she couldn't explain, the unspoken truth she couldn't quite grasp. But I could see it in her face every time she asked herself that question, could I have saved her? I didn't have an answer for her. No one did. The police were relentless, digging into every corner of Evelina's life, following every thread until they found something worth chasing. It didn't take long before the detectives began to piece together a bigger picture, one I hadn't anticipated. The death, the robbery, the violence, it wasn't just a random act of cruelty. It was part of something far more calculated, far more sinister. They started by going through Evelina's bank statements. A trail of withdrawals, transfers, and strange transactions popped up. Large sums of money had been sent to accounts in Simon's name, some under his full name, others under aliases. At first, they couldn't understand why this was happening. After all, Evelina had seemed so in love, so trusting. But as they dug deeper, they found more accounts, wires, money being funneled to places it shouldn't have been. Then they started checking her social media. It didn't take long before they discovered Simon's messages, hundreds of them, most of them sent through direct messages on platforms like Facebook and Instagram. They were loving, sweet words at first, filled with promises of a beautiful life together. Simon had known exactly what to say to keep Evelina hooked. He'd promised her everything, a future, a family, a life beyond what she had known. He had been careful with his words, crafting a story that made Evelina feel special, like she was the only one that mattered. The messages became more frequent, the promises more desperate. As his financial needs grew, so did the requests. It wasn't long before he had her convinced that sending him money was just a small price to pay for the life they were supposed to share. What stood out to the detectives, however, was how Evelina had kept sending the money. She had emptied her savings, used credit cards, and even borrowed money from friends, all to support Simon, all to keep him happy. They found records of these transactions, and they realized it wasn't just small amounts here and there. No, these were large sums, substantial amounts that Evelina had no way of explaining, but Simon had an answer for everything. Each time, he made her believe that it was temporary, that once they were together, everything would be all right. The detectives also discovered the robbery itself was methodical. Simon and his friends had gone through her apartment with precision, taking everything they could, cash, jewelry, her phone, anything of value. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was planned. And Simon had made sure that the apartment was empty before he and his associates moved in. He had orchestrated the entire thing. His friends, likely involved in the same kinds of scams, had known exactly what to do. It was clear to the detectives now, Simon had never truly loved Evelina. She had been nothing more than a mark, a means to an end. He had used her, manipulated her emotions, and bled her dry until there was nothing left. When the money ran out, when she couldn't give him any more, he did what any desperate man would do. He took what he needed by force. But the detectives weren't done. They had to figure out who Simon was, who his friends were, and how deep this whole thing went. It was clear now that Evelina wasn't the only victim. This wasn't just some random crime of passion. Simon was part of a larger scheme, one that preyed on vulnerable people like Evelina, promising them love and a future, only to take everything they had and move on to the next victim. They found Simon's connections. It wasn't just one or two people he had manipulated, there were several others, each with a story similar to Evelina's. There were reports of women, older women, who had been scammed in similar ways, each one being convinced by Simon that they were the one. Each one had been slowly drained of their resources, and when they were no longer of any use, he moved on. And that's when the detectives hit pay dirt. They found the connection to the larger network of fraudsters. Simon wasn't acting alone. He had been working with a group of people, possibly even operating under the protection of someone higher up in the food chain. The money they were stealing from women like Evelina was being funneled into a larger criminal enterprise. The scope of the operation was growing by the day. The detectives had the evidence now: bank transactions, social media interactions, phone records. They had everything they needed to make their case, but there was one thing that still hung over them: finding Simon. He had slipped through the cracks, vanished like smoke into the night. He had learned how to cover his tracks, how to stay just one step ahead of the law. He knew exactly what he was doing. But the evidence they had was enough. It was clear to everyone that Simon was not just a man scamming for money. He was part of a larger network, a predator that had been targeting vulnerable women for years. And now, Evelina was dead because of him. He had used her, broken her down, and when she was no longer of value to him, he took everything. The investigation didn't end with Simon. As the detectives kept digging, they uncovered a network of criminals who had been operating for years, stealing from women like Evelina, using the same tactics, the same lies. They were all connected, part of something much larger than a single crime. And Sophie, Evelina's daughter, had to face the painful truth. Her mother wasn't just a random victim of a violent crime. She was part of a much larger scam. And Simon wasn't just some heartless conman. He was a cog in a machine that had been operating for years, destroying lives. Sophie could never have known. How could she? Her mother had been too caught up in the illusion Simon had created to see the truth. And even if Sophie had noticed the warning signs, how could she have known how deep the deception went? Now, the detectives were left to clean up the mess. They had Simon's name, his face, and his connections. They would find him, eventually. But no matter what they did, no matter how hard they tried to stop the fraudsters, it wouldn't bring Evelina back. She was gone, a casualty of a scheme that had stolen her heart, her money, and ultimately her life. And Sophie was left to piece together the wreckage, asking herself if there was something she could have done to save her mother, to stop Simon before it was too late. But the truth, however painful, was clear: it wasn't her fault. She couldn't have known. She wasn't the one who killed her mother. But Simon, and the others like him, were still out there. And they weren't going to stop until they had taken everything they could from someone else. The arrest of Simon and his accomplices came like a heavy wave crashing against everything I had tried to build. The detectives had pieced together the puzzle, and it didn't take long for them to close in on Simon. His network of fraudsters, the ones he had used to drain Evelina's life savings and destroy her, had been exposed. The police had enough evidence: the bank transactions, the messages, the phone records, the testimonies of the other women he had preyed on. And then, of course, there was the murder. When the arrest happened, it wasn't a surprise to me. I knew it was coming. But for Sophie, it was another step in the nightmare. She had been living in a haze since her mother's death, piecing together the shattered fragments of her life. She had watched the police close in on Simon and his friends, watched as they were hauled away, their faces blank with indifference. Simon, cold as ever, barely flinched as the cuffs were put on him. He knew he had been caught, but in that moment, he didn't seem to care. The trial was another ordeal altogether. It dragged on for months, and every moment felt like a new chapter of pain. Sophie was called to testify, her voice trembling but strong. She spoke about her mother, the woman who had trusted Simon, the woman who had been manipulated, who had been made to believe that she was in a loving relationship. Sophie described the lies, the promises of a future that Simon had used to control her mother. And then, through the blur of her tears, she described how she had found out that her mother was dead, how she had never imagined that the man she had loved and trusted was capable of such cruelty. Her testimony was heartbreaking. The courtroom was silent as Sophie spoke, her words raw with grief and regret. You could feel the weight of it in the air. She told them everything: how Simon had stolen from her mother, how he had taken advantage of Evelina's kindness, and how, in the end, it had cost her mother her life. She spoke about the woman she had lost and the man who had taken her from her. Simon didn't say a word during the trial. He didn't need to. The evidence was clear, and the truth was undeniable. He had manipulated, robbed, and killed. The jury didn't deliberate long. They found him guilty on all counts: fraud, theft, and murder. When the judge passed down the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, it was a moment that felt both final and hollow. There would be no closure for Sophie, no magic moment where everything was made right. Her mother was gone, and no amount of justice could bring her back. But at least Simon would never have the chance to hurt anyone else. After the trial, Sophie was left to pick up the pieces. It was a long road, and I saw the toll it took on her. The grief, the anger, the confusion, it all mixed together, swirling around her like a storm she couldn't escape. But she did something with it. She didn't let it break her. She took the pain and turned it into purpose. Sophie began to speak out. She started sharing her mother's story, warning others about the dangers of online manipulation. She spoke at community events, at forums, at schools, educating people on the tactics that scammers like Simon used to prey on vulnerable individuals. She became an advocate for victims of online fraud, pushing for more stringent laws and better protection for people who fell prey to such schemes. But it wasn't just about the larger fight for justice. Sophie also became more active within her own family. She made sure to maintain open lines of communication with her relatives, especially her elderly family members, so they wouldn't fall into the same traps her mother had. She emphasized the importance of talking about relationships, of being open with loved ones about the people they were trusting, especially when those relationships were built through online interactions. Sophie began to see that awareness and vigilance were key. She made sure that no one in her family felt isolated or alone, that they had someone they could turn to if something seemed off. She also began to look at her own relationships differently, understanding the subtle ways manipulation could creep in, the ways people like Simon could worm their way into someone's life without them even realizing it. It wasn't just about protecting her own family, though. Sophie became part of a larger community of people who were fighting against online scams. She worked with organizations that provided resources for victims, helping them understand what had happened to them and how they could get their lives back. She became an advocate for stronger regulations on online dating sites, pressuring them to take greater responsibility for preventing scams and protecting their users. The grief was still there, of course. It would always be there, just beneath the surface. Every now and then, Sophie would get a call from a friend or a relative, someone who had heard about her work, asking for advice. She'd listen to their stories, and sometimes, just for a moment, she'd catch herself remembering her mother, the way Evelina had been before everything had gone so wrong. But Sophie had become a different person. She had learned from the tragedy. She understood now that prevention was the key, that education was the way to stop more people from falling victim to the same kinds of scams that had taken her mother's life. There were days when Sophie still couldn't believe that it had all happened, that her mother had been manipulated to the point of losing everything, her money, her trust, her life. But there were fewer of those days now. The anger had softened into something else, a quiet resolve. She knew that her mother's death, as horrific as it had been, wasn't in vain. It had sparked something in her, something that made her want to fight for others, to make sure no one else had to go through what her mother had. Sophie was no longer just a victim of Simon's scheme. She had become a fighter, a protector, someone who was using her own experience to make sure that tragedy like hers didn't happen to anyone else. She wasn't just living with the aftermath of her mother's death. She was actively making the world a safer place, one conversation, one warning at a time. And in doing so, she had finally found some peace.